Welcome to our deep dive. You've given us quite the stack of sources this time, all about the biology of human behavior.
Yeah.
So we've got evolution, we've got, how our brains work.
Right.
This should be fun. Lots to unpack.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
I think so, yeah. What I find really fascinating about this set of sources is that, a lot of times we think about human behavior as all about our choices and experiences, right?
Yeah.
But this stuff really digs into how much our biology plays a role, like our genes and hormones.
Oh, yeah.
And even the structure of our brains. So basically, we're talking experiments in evolutionary biology.
Exactly. And when you start to understand that biological side, you can get some incredible insights into why we do the things we do.
Right. Like even the stuff that seems, completely normal to us.
Right. Yeah. Even the really small stuff, but also the stuff that seems extraordinary. Both sides.
One of the things I found really interesting in these sources is this idea of categorical thinking. I mean, like we, as humans, we love to put things into neat little boxes, right?
Yeah.
But the source is arguing that actually kind of limits our understanding of something as complex as human behavior.
Absolutely. It's like, it's like trying to force, round peg, square hole, right?
Yeah.
But the source uses this example of color perception. It says, we think of a rainbow as the spectrum of colors, right? But different languages, they actually divide those colors up differently. So, what one culture might call blue might not be the same blue to another culture. Their brains have actually been trained to categorize it differently because of their language.
So our language actually shapes how we see the world?
Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Pretty wild.
And I guess, thinking about this in terms of behavior, we could be creating artificial categories that actually misleads us when we try to understand human behavior.
100%. Yeah. And this source goes on to say, even scientists or even the experts often fall into this trap.
Oh, really?
Of trying to oversimplify things. They try to explain behavior just through one lens. Like they'll focus just on genes or hormones or whatever.
It's like just picking one bucket to explain everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like this person is aggressive because of this one gene, or they're, anxious because of this chemical imbalance.
Right.
But it's never that simple.
Yeah.
And the source actually gives some pretty shocking examples of how this kind of thinking has had really bad, really terrible outcomes.
Like what?
Well, there's this guy, Igas Moniz. He was a neurologist, won a Nobel Prize and everything.
Wow.
But he was the one who pioneered the procedure for frontal lobotomies.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
He actually believed that by, cutting these connections in the brain, that he could cure mental illness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we know how those lobotomies turned out, right?
Yeah.
Devastating.
Absolutely devastating. And it's a clear example of what can go wrong when you reduce complex behavior to just one biological factor.
Yeah, that's a really dark side to that kind of oversimplification.
Yeah. And the source actually highlights an even darker example. Conrad Lorenz, considered the father of ethology.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
He did all this research on animal behavior, won a Nobel Prize too.
Yeah, I think I remember learning about his work on imprinting in birds.
Oh, yeah.
Really fascinating stuff.
Totally. But here's the thing. He was also a Nazi propagandist, and he actually used his research to justify, the Nazis' eugenics programs and all that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really chilling reminder that even brilliant minds can fall prey to this kind of dangerous thinking when they oversimplify these incredibly complex issues.
It's a good reminder to always be thinking critically and to consider all the different perspectives.
Yeah.
It seems like we're always trying to figure out that balance between our similarities to animals and our uniquely human qualities.
Right. And that tension, that's a key theme that runs through all these sources. They actually lay out three major challenges we face when we try to understand, the biology of human behavior.
Okay.
The first challenge, is just accepting that we are animals.
Right.
We share so much of our biology and our behavior with other creatures.
Like that thing about menstrual synchrony happening in both humans and hamsters?
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing how connected we are to the animal kingdom.
It really is.
But then there's that second challenge, right? Even though we share those basic responses with animals, we often use them in ways that are totally unique to humans.
Right, yeah.
Like the source gives this example of chess grandmasters.
Oh, yeah.
Like during a really intense chess match, their heart rates and blood pressure, they go through the roof. Like you'd see those same levels in someone running a marathon.
Wow.
But they're just sitting there, moving pieces on a board.
It's like our brains have evolved to trigger those like primal fight or flight responses,
Right.
even when there's no physical danger.
Yeah, yeah.
It's incredible how much we've been able to hijack those ancient mechanisms with our, capacity for strategy and stuff.
Totally. And then, of course, you got the third challenge. Like, how do you even begin to understand the behaviors that seem to be completely unique to humans?
Right.
Like, the source uses the example of monogamy.
Yeah, monogamy's a tough one.
From a purely biological perspective, it's really hard to explain why humans would choose to stay with the same partner day after day, when in the animal kingdom, it's all about spreading those genes as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher from an evolutionary perspective.
So it seems like we're this weird mix of being just like every other animal and yet completely different.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to make sense of that?
Well, that's where evolutionary psychology comes in.
Okay.
It tries to give us a framework to understand how our minds actually evolved to solve the specific problems our ancestors faced, which led to both those shared and unique behaviors.
So it's like our minds are a collection of tools,
Yeah.
all shaken by evolution to help us, survive and reproduce.
That's the basic idea.
Okay.
Yeah. And this source explains that these tools are what evolutionary psychologists call adaptations.
Okay.
Traits that have been honed by natural selection over millions of years.
So, like, give me an example of an adaptation.
Okay, think about the fear of snakes. Lots of people have this built-in aversion to snakes.
Oh, yeah. Even if they've never even, seen a venomous snake in person.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right? Because for our ancestors, being afraid of snakes would have helped them avoid getting bitten and dying so they could pass on their genes.
Like a built-in warning system.
Yeah. Like a little alarm bell going off.
Even though, most of us don't even encounter venomous snakes in our daily lives anymore.
Right, but evolution works on those really long time scales. But evolutionary psychologists also say that not everything in our minds is a direct adaptation. They also talk about what they call byproducts and noise.
Byproducts and noise.
Yeah, think about the belly button.
Okay.
The umbilical cord, that's an adaptation, right?
Yeah.
It's, for transferring nutrients to the fetus. But the belly button itself, it doesn't do anything. It's just a byproduct of the process.
It's just there.
Yeah, just a leftover. And then there's noise. That's random variation. So the shape and size of your belly button, that's just noise.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't really serve any particular purpose.
Got it.
Yeah. And these same ideas, they apply to psychological traits too. Some variations in personality or behavior, they might just be random noise, not adaptations or byproducts.
So adaptations are like the functional tools in our minds. Byproducts are those leftovers. And noise is just that random variation.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay. This evolutionary psychology stuff is really starting to make sense to me.
Good.
It's providing a framework to understand how our behaviors came to be, even the ones that seem really puzzling.
Right.
Contradictory.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's the whole idea of sexual selection, right?
Oh, yeah, sexual selection.
This is where things get really interesting. This idea that certain traits evolve not because they help us survive, but because they help us attract a mate.
Right.
And reproduce.
Exactly. Think about the peacock's tail.
Yeah, classic example.
That huge, colorful tail makes it harder for them to fly, but the peons love it.
The peons love it.
They go crazy for it. So the males with the most impressive tails, they get to mate more, pass on their genes.
It's a pretty good trade-off, if you ask me.
Right. And some evolutionary psychologists think that the human mind itself might actually be a product of sexual selection.
Whoa. What do you mean by that?
Well, maybe our capacity for language, for creativity, for social intelligence, maybe all that stuff evolved because it was attractive to potential mates.
So all those late-night philosophical debates in college weren't just procrastination?
Maybe not.
They were showcasing our evolutionary fitness.
It's an interesting possibility.
That's wild.
Yeah, but evolutionary psychology also acknowledges that our evolved minds, they aren't always perfectly suited for our modern environments. And that's where the idea of mismatch comes in.
Mismatch theory.
Yeah, the idea is that our brains are basically wired for a Stone Age world.
Right.
But now we live in this crazy, fast-paced digital age.
Right, and it doesn't always work out so well.
It really doesn't. Think about our cravings for, sugary and fatty foods. Those were really valuable for our ancestors because food was scarce.
You had to get those calories when you could.
Exactly.
But now we live in a world where those foods are everywhere.
Yeah, way too easy to get.
And those cravings, they actually contribute to obesity and health problems.
Yeah, it's a classic example of mismatch. And it doesn't just apply to food either. You can see mismatch in everything from our addiction to social media to our struggles with anxiety and depression.
It's like our Stone Age brains are trying to navigate a digital age world,
Yeah,
and it's not always a smooth ride.
not smooth at all.
Okay, so this mismatch theory it's really fascinating.
It is, yeah.
But how do evolutionary psychologists actually go about developing their hypotheses?
Well, it's not just about coming up with like a good story. They have a system.
Okay.
They start by identifying a particular problem that our ancestors would have faced, like, say, avoiding predators.
Okay.
Then they think about what cues our ancestors would have used to solve that problem. So, like, maybe the rustling of leaves or the shadow of a hawk.
So they're reverse engineering the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to figure out those evolutionary pressures
Exactly.
that shaped a certain behavior.
Right. And then they think about how those cues would have been processed by the brain. That's the input. And then what the resulting behavior would be, like running away or freezing. That's the output.
Interesting.
And finally, they think about how culture might have shaped those adaptations.
So even though we share these evolved mechanisms,
Yeah.
culture plays a role in how they're expressed.
Exactly. It's not just biology, it's also culture.
Okay, so give me a specific example.
Okay, well, the source talks about disgust sensitivity as an adaptation to avoid disease.
Okay,
Like being disgusted by rotten food, that helps us avoid getting sick.
makes sense.
Right? But what's considered disgusting, that can be really different across cultures.
Yeah, I can see that.
The source mentions this study where people were shown these pictures of things that kind of look like bodily fluids.
Oh, okay.
Some looked more like they came from a human and some didn't.
Okay.
And get this, people were way more disgusted by the images that looked like they could have come from a human, even if they were just like colored blobs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's like our disgust response is specifically tuned to detect stuff that might carry human pathogens.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's really smart.
And there was another study where they found that people's skin actually became more sensitive after they were exposed to disgusting stimuli.
Really?
Yeah, like it's as if their bodies were trying to, avoid contact with any potential contaminants.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right?
It's incredible how our psychology and our physiology work together to keep us safe.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
But, as cool as all this evolutionary psychology stuff is, we do have to acknowledge that it has its critics.
Right.
They raise some good points about the field's assumptions and methods and even how it could be misused.
I definitely want to dive into those criticisms.
Yeah.
But maybe before we do that,
Yeah.
could you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways from evolutionary psychology so far?
Sure. We've seen how evolutionary psychology tries to understand human behavior by thinking about the problems our ancestors had to solve, which led to things like adaptations, byproducts, and noise in our psychology. We also talked about sexual selection, mismatch theory, and how evolutionary psychologists actually come up with their hypotheses.
Yeah, that's a good summary. It's pretty amazing to think about how much our past still influences who we are today.
Right, like we're still carrying around that ancient baggage in our brains.
Totally. But you mentioned some criticisms of evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, there are definitely some things we need to think about.
So in the next part of our deep dive,
Yes.
let's dig into those criticisms and explore the limitations and potential pitfalls of this whole field.
Sounds good to me.
Stay tuned.
All right.
Okay, so we've talked about how evolutionary psychology can be really insightful for understanding human behavior,
Yeah.
but, it's not without its critics.
Right.
What are some of the major concerns they raise?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that it can be a little too reductionist.
Reductionist.
Yeah, like it tries to oversimplify complex behaviors by attributing everything to our genes and our evolutionary past.
So you're saying it doesn't give enough weight to,
Right.
culture, individual experiences, all that.
Exactly. It's like saying we're all just puppets of our genes, which we know is not true.
Not true at all.
We make choices.
We learn, we grow. It's not all
Sucker.
predetermined.
And this oversimplification, it can lead to some pretty problematic assumptions.
Like what?
Well, for example, it can, reinforce those old gender stereotypes by saying the differences between men and women are all about biology
Oh, I see.
and not, also about social and cultural factors.
It's like that whole debate about whether men are naturally better at math and science than women.
Right, exactly. Is it really a biological difference or
Right.
is it just, societal expectations and how we raise boys and girls?
Right.
It's a really important question to consider.
And this kind of brings us to another criticism, right?
Mm-hmm.
The potential for misinterpreting and even misusing evolutionary psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
Like there's a real danger that these ideas could be, twisted to justify bad behavior or,
Right.
Reinforce existing power structures like those, what are they called? Those Manosphere communities online
Oh, yeah.
that use evolutionary psychology to promote these really misogynistic views.
Yeah, those guys.
It's frustrating, right? They just cherry pick the bits of research that fit their agenda.
Exactly. And they completely ignore the nuances and the complexities of the theory.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how, like, scientific ideas can be taken out of context and used to support, really harmful beliefs.
Yeah, it's a shame. And it makes it even more important for us to be careful about how we communicate these findings.
And how we interpret them.
Exactly. And to remember that even the best research has its limitations.
That's true.
We talked about just so stories before.
Yeah, can you remind me what that means again?
Sure. A just so story is basically an explanation that sounds good, but there's no real evidence to back it up.
Okay.
It's like saying humans evolved to love music because it helped them bond as a tribe. It might be true, but it's really hard to prove scientifically.
Yeah, it seems like you could come up with a just-so story to explain almost anything.
Exactly. And sometimes evolutionary psychology does fall into that trap.
It's more like storytelling than actual science.
Yeah, sometimes it can feel that way. And then there's the problem of just, the difficulty of actually studying our evolutionary past.
Right.
I mean, we can't go back in time.
Can't hop in a time machine.
Exactly. So we have to rely on things like fossils.
Okay.
And archaeological remains.
Makes sense.
And comparisons to modern hunter-gatherer societies. But even those modern societies, they might not accurately reflect, what life was like for our ancestors.
It's like trying to understand ancient Rome
Yeah.
by studying modern-day Italy. There are going to be similarities,
Right.
but also a lot of differences.
Exactly. So yeah, evolutionary psychology can offer valuable insights.
Yeah.
But we've got to approach it with some healthy skepticism.
I like that. Healthy skepticism.
Yeah. We can't just take everything at face value.
And we've got to be aware of its limitations.
Exactly.
This is really making me think.
Good.
It's like evolutionary psychology really forces us to ask these fundamental questions about who we are and why we do the things we do.
Right. And it helps us see ourselves as part of this grand evolutionary story.
Connected to all living things, shaped by forces that have been at play for millions of years.
It's a pretty amazing perspective.
It's both humbling and awe-inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. But maybe let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about some specific ways that evolutionary psychology tries to explain, actual human behavior.
Sounds good.
The sources get into some really interesting examples,
Okay.
like aggression and sexuality.
Oh, those are big topics.
Yeah, they are. Where should we start?
Let's start with aggression. It's often seen as a negative trait.
Right.
But I'm guessing evolutionary psychology has a different take on it.
Yeah, evolutionary psychologists would say that aggression actually serves some important functions for our ancestors.
Like what?
Like, defending themselves from predators,
Okay.
competing for resources, establishing dominance within a group.
So you're saying aggression isn't necessarily bad. It's all about contest.
Exactly. And there's a lot of variation in aggression, even between, males and females of the same species. Some individuals are just more prone to it than others.
Right.
And how aggression is expressed, that's heavily influenced by the environment, too.
Okay, so it's not like there's an aggression gene
No.
that makes someone violent.
No, it's way more complicated than that.
But I'm curious,
Yeah.
why do evolutionary psychologists think that men, on average, tend to be more physically aggressive than women?
Well, one theory is that, historically, men competed more directly for mates and resources.
Okay.
So they evolved a greater propensity for physical aggression. Like, imagine those massive elephant seals
Oh, yeah.
battling it out on the beach.
It's intense.
Right. Or, male chimps fighting for control of a territory.
Right, those are some pretty high-stakes competitions.
Yeah, they are. And those competitions, over millions of years, they could have driven the evolution of male aggression in those species.
But how does that apply to humans? I mean, we don't typically engage in those kinds of brutal physical battles anymore.
That's true. And we have to remember that these are just hypotheses.
Right.
And human behavior is incredibly complex. It's shaped by biology and culture.
That's both.
So, yeah, evolutionary pressures might have played a role, but we can't just reduce human aggression to just biology, right?
It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And we can't just apply these evolutionary explanations to individuals, right? Just because, on average, men might be more physically aggressive, it doesn't mean every single man is going to be violent.
Right. There are plenty of peaceful men out there.
Exactly. And plenty of aggressive women, too. Culture and social norms, they play a huge role in shaping how we express those tendencies.
Absolutely. And I bet that applies to all sorts of behaviors, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Take sexuality, for example.
Okay, let's talk about sex. What's the evolutionary psychology take on that?
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, Sex is all about reproduction. Pass on your genes.
Makes sense.
But men and women have faced different challenges when it comes to reproduction, right?
Oh, yeah, because women, they invest a lot more time and energy in pregnancy.
Right.
And child-rearing.
Exactly. So evolutionary psychologists would say that women evolved to be more attracted to men who can provide resources and protection,
Okay.
while men evolved to be more attracted to women who are, fertile and healthy.
So are you saying that our mate preferences are, like, hardwired into us?
Well, it's not that straightforward. There is some evidence that men and women prioritize different things in a partner,
Okay,
but culture also plays a huge role in shaping those preferences.
of course.
What's considered attractive or desirable, that changes across cultures and even within the same culture over time.
Right, so it's biology and culture
Always.
working together.
Always. And the same perspective applies to other things too, like personality.
Oh, okay. Like, if evolution shaped our bodies and our mating preferences, then it probably shaped our personalities too, right?
Yeah, that's what evolutionary psychologists think. They believe that certain personality traits like extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, that these might have provided advantages for our ancestors.
In certain environment, yeah.
Exactly. So, for example, imagine you're living in a small hunter-gatherer band.
Okay.
Being outgoing and sociable, that could have helped you form alliances, attract mates, get access to resources.
Right, that makes sense.
But then on the other hand, being introverted,
Yeah.
that might have been good for people who excelled at tasks that required, solitude and focus.
Like tool making or strategizing.
Yeah, exactly. So like different personalities were suited to different roles within the group.
Everybody playing their part.
Exactly, and everyone contributing to the success of the tribe. And evolutionary psychologists suggest that this variation in personality, it could be a result of something called frequency-dependent selection.
Frequency-dependent selection. Can you remind me what that is?
Yeah, it means that how beneficial a trait is depends on how common it is in the population.
Oh, okay.
So if everyone's extroverted,
Yeah.
there might actually be an advantage to being introverted.
Because you stand out.
Yeah, you fill a different niche.
It's like a balancing act.
Yeah.
Right. The right mix of personality types, it probably changed over time depending on the environment and the social dynamics.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that these are just tendencies, not absolutes.
Right.
Right. Just because a trait might have been advantageous in the past doesn't mean it's going to guarantee success today.
Times have changed.
Right. Our modern world, it throws very different challenges at us.
Okay, this is all fascinating stuff. But there's one area where evolutionary psychology gets really tricky.
What's that?
Mental illness? Like, how can you explain something like depression or anxiety from an evolutionary perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely a sensitive and complex area.
It just seems counterintuitive that those conditions could have been adaptive.
I know, right? But evolutionary psychologists have proposed this idea called the smoke detector principle.
The smoke detector principle.
Yeah, imagine you have a smoke detector that's super sensitive.
Okay.
Like, it goes off even when there's just a bit of steam from the shower.
Annoying.
Super annoying, but it's better to have a smoke detector that goes off too often than one that doesn't go off at all when there's a real fire.
That's true.
So the idea is that conditions like depression and anxiety, they might be like overly sensitive alarm systems.
I see.
So, for example, evolutionary psychologists suggest that depression might be an exaggerated response to social threats.
Like being rejected or losing status.
Exactly. And for our ancestors, being ostracized from a group could have meant death.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious consequence.
Right. So our brains might have evolved to be extra sensitive to social threats, even if those threats aren't as serious in our modern world.
So it's like our ancient survival mechanisms are misfiring in a world where social rejection isn't a death sentence anymore?
Exactly. And the same logic applies to anxiety, too.
Okay.
It might have helped our ancestors avoid danger and stay vigilant for threats.
Okay.
But nowadays, it can spiral out of control and become a real problem.
It's another example of that mismatch theory we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Our Stone Age brains are just not equipped to handle all the complexities of modern life.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but there are some real concerns about applying evolutionary psychology to mental illness.
Oh, yeah. What are those?
Well, some critics worry that it minimizes the suffering of people who are struggling with these conditions.
Right. It can sound kind of dismissive.
Yeah, it's like saying, well, cancer was probably adaptive at some point in evolution, so we shouldn't bother trying to cure it.
Right. That's absurd.
Totally absurd. Just because something might have had a purpose of our evolutionary past doesn't mean it's still beneficial or acceptable today.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help people who are suffering.
Absolutely. And, evolution doesn't always lead to perfect outcomes.
Right.
Sometimes it creates vulnerability.
Perks.
Yeah.
And even, traits that can cause a lot of suffering.
Exactly. And that's why we have medicine, psychology, all sorts of interventions to help us deal with those challenges.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
But I'm starting to feel a bit overwhelmed with all this information.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Before we get into the criticisms of evolutionary psychology, do you think we could recap the key points about its applications to, aggression, sexuality, and mental illness?
Sure, we've explored how evolutionary psychology looks at human behavior through the lens of the challenges our ancestors faced.
Okay.
We talked about how aggression, even though it's often seen as negative, might have served some important functions in the past. But we also acknowledge that biology and culture work together to shape how aggression is expressed today.
Makes sense.
Then we discussed evolutionary perspectives on sexuality, exploring potential differences in mate preferences between men and women.
Yeah.
But again, emphasizing the importance of cultural influences.
Right.
And finally, we talked about how evolutionary psychology approaches mental illness, suggesting that things like depression and anxiety might have had some adaptive value in our evolutionary past.
Okay.
But it's crucial to treat these conditions with compassion and care in our modern world.
I agree.
Because they can cause a lot of suffering.
That was a really helpful summary. It really is mind-blowing to think about how much our past still shapes our present.
I know, it's amazing.
But as we've said, there are some valid criticisms of evolutionary psychology that we need to address.
Right.
So in the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
let's explore those criticisms in more detail.
Sounds good.
And really grapple with the limitations and potential pitfalls of this whole field.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's get into those criticisms of evolutionary psychology.
Right.
You mentioned reductionism earlier.
Yeah.
Could you explain why that's a concern?
Sure. Reductionism, in this context, it basically means oversimplifying things.
Okay.
Like boiling down complex phenomena to just one cause or few factors.
Right.
And critics argue that evolutionary psychology sometimes does this.
How so?
By attributing human behavior only to our genes and evolution,
Okay.
and not giving enough consideration to culture, learning, personal experiences.
So it's like saying we're all just slaves to our genes.
Yeah, kind of, but we know that's not really true, right?
Not at all. We make choices, we learn, we grow.
Exactly. We're not just robots programmed by our DNA.
Right.
And this kind of oversimplification, it can lead to some pretty messed up assumptions.
Like what?
Well, it can reinforce gender stereotypes
Oh, okay.
by saying that differences between men and women are purely biological.
Ah, I see.
And not taking into account the huge impact of social and cultural norms.
That makes sense.
The sources actually have some good examples of how cultural norms can, totally override these supposed evolutionary drives.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Like the idea that men everywhere prefer women with a certain waist-to-hip ratio.
Okay.
Turns out those preferences vary widely across cultures and time.
Really?
Yeah. And then there's that whole maternal instinct thing.
Okay.
In some cultures, motherhood is defined more by social roles than biology.
That's interesting.
Right? So these cultural differences, they challenge the idea that there are, universal biologically determined behaviors for everyone.
So we really can't just assume that every behavior has a simple evolutionary explanation.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the criticism of just so stories? We talked about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But I'd like to hear more about why that's a concern.
Sure. Just so stories are basically explanations that sound plausible, but there's no actual evidence to back them up.
Okay.
It's like saying humans are afraid of the dark because predators were more likely to attack at night.
Makes sense on the surface.
Right, but without solid evidence, it's just a story.
It seems like you could come up with a just so story to explain anything.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's the problem.
How do you tell the difference between a legit evolutionary explanation
Right.
and one that's just pure speculation?
That's the million-dollar question. A good scientific theory should make predictions that can be tested,
Right.
Supported or disproven by evidence. But with evolutionary psychology, it can be really tough to design experiments that can, definitively prove or disprove a hypothesis.
I guess that's because we can't go back in time and observe our ancestors.
Exactly. We have to rely on fossils, archaeology, comparisons with modern hunter-gatherer societies.
Which, as we've discussed, might not even be that accurate.
Yeah, they're not perfect analogs for our ancestors.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. You can guess, but you can't be sure you're right.
And that leads to another criticism, right? The potential for bias.
Oh, absolutely. Because we're working with incomplete information about the past.
Yeah.
It's easy for our own assumptions and biases to sneak into our interpretations.
So we need to be extra careful about acknowledging our own biases and considering alternative explanations.
100%. And we also have to be aware of how evolutionary psychology can be misused to know, like those Manosphere groups we talked about.
Right, those guys twist evolutionary concepts to support their, like, misogynistic views.
Exactly. It's a reminder that scientific knowledge is powerful,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a responsibility to use it ethically.
But even if we're careful and critical, doesn't evolutionary psychology still raise questions about free will?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's the classic nature versus nurture debate.
Right.
It's a question philosophers have been arguing about for centuries.
Does our evolutionary past determine our actions, or do we have a choice?
Right. Evolutionary psychology definitely suggests that biology plays a big role.
Mm-hmm.
But most evolutionary psychologists would say that it doesn't totally eliminate free will.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Not at all. It's about the interplay between biology and environment.
I see.
Our genes might, make us more likely to have certain tendencies,
Okay.
but they don't control everything we do.
We still have the ability to make conscious choices.
Absolutely.
Our experiences matter. Our upbringing matters. The culture we live in matters.
All of that shapes who we are and how we behave.
It's like our genes provide a blueprint, but our environment and our choices determine how that blueprint gets expressed.
I like that analogy.
And understanding our biology, it shouldn't make us feel less responsible for our actions.
Absolutely not.
It should help us understand the forces that influence us, both biological and cultural,
Exactly.
so that we can make better choices and create a better world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've explored the fascinating world of evolutionary psychology, looked at its limitations, and really wrestled with some big questions about what it means to be human.
It's been a really thought-provoking journey.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a new way to think about human behavior. Remember, the journey of self-discovery never really ends.
There's always more to learn and explore.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely.